My name is Crystal Lynn Hargrove. I'm 34 years old, and the last thing my ex-husband said to me before he asked for a divorce was that he needed to be free. He sat on the edge of our couch, the gray sectional I picked out, in the living room I painted twice because the first color wasn't right, and he looked at me with this expression I can only describe as rehearsed relief, like he'd been practicing the face in the mirror, and he said he thought we'd grown apart. He said he needed something different. He said he wanted a divorce. And I looked at him for a long moment, and I said, "Okay." He blinked. I don't think he expected that. I think he expected tears or pleading, or at minimum, a raised voice. What he got was a woman who had been ready for this conversation for approximately 6 weeks, sitting across from him on the couch she also picked out, completely still. What Derek did not know, what he could not have known, because he had spent 6 years fundamentally misreading who I was, is that the word okay was not acceptance. It was a door opening, and I was already walking through it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really starts. Before I do, if you found this video and something about that first 30 seconds already felt familiar, I need you to stay. Hit the like button, subscribe so you don't miss a single part of this, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I post late and I know people find me from all over, and honestly, knowing you're out there makes me want to tell this right. Now let me go back to the beginning. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the middle child of 3. My father was an electrician who worked double shifts his entire adult life without once complaining about it in my presence. My mother was warm the way a house is warm. You felt it, but nobody said it out loud. We were not a family that named things. We were a family that managed them. What I learned growing up in that house, and I didn't understand this until much later, is that the women in my family were experts at absorbing, at adapting, at making peace the priority over truth. Not because they were weak. I want to be clear about that. My mother was one of the most quietly capable people I have ever known. But there was a blueprint passed down through the women in my family that said, see everything, say nothing, and build your safety net in private. I watched my mother do this once. I was 11 years old. I came downstairs for water at midnight and found her at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator and a bank statement that wasn't from their joint account. She didn't explain what she was doing. She just looked at me and said, "Go back to bed, baby." I went back to bed, but I didn't forget what I saw. That image, my mother at that kitchen table, perfectly composed, building something private in the dark, lived inside me for the next 23 years. I didn't know it was going to become the most useful thing she ever taught me. I put myself through the University of Tennessee on a partial scholarship and weekend hotel shifts. I studied marketing because it was the intersection of the two things I was actually good at, understanding what people wanted and knowing how to speak to it. I graduated without debt because I tracked every dollar I had like it might disappear, which, growing up, it sometimes had. I built a career at a firm called Meridian Creative Group. Started as an associate, moved to strategist, then senior strategist. I was offered a director title 8 months before any of this happened. I kept deferring it. Not because I didn't want it. I wanted it badly. But because Derek had this way of making comments about my schedule that made accepting it feel like a negotiation I didn't have energy for. Little things. You're already gone a lot. We never have time for us. Nothing you could point at directly. Just pressure, applied consistently, like water finding the lowest point. I married Derek Hargrove at 31. He was steady and successful and certain in a way I found genuinely reassuring after a college relationship with a man who was neither. Derek was a regional sales director. He wore good suits. He shook hands firmly and remembered names and made people feel seen. At work, in social situations, at dinner parties. I thought for a long time that the version of him I saw at home, quieter, more critical, subtly dismissive of things I was proud of, was just the private face everyone has, the face that doesn't perform. I was wrong. That wasn't his private face. That was the only face I was allowed to see. I found out about Natalie Cross on a Tuesday night in October. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing wine glasses when I noticed our shared streaming account had logged in from a Marriott in downtown Nashville, 45 minutes away. Derek had told me he had a client dinner. I set the glass down. I dried my hands. I went to the kitchen table, the same table, always the table, and I opened my laptop. The Marriott on 2nd Avenue. Not fancy enough to be impressive, just expensive enough to be deliberate. I cross-referenced the date against the Google Calendar Derek had given me read-only access to years ago, as if that gesture meant transparency. There was a block on the calendar. It said D+N, confirmed. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called my sister Becca from the driveway, in my car with the windows up. "He's been seeing someone from work," I said. "I think her name is Natalie." Becca said, "Crystal, baby, what do you want to do?" I said, "Nothing yet." She was quiet. Then, "Nothing?" "I need to understand what I'm looking at before I move." And that was the beginning of 4 months that I can only describe as the most clarifying period of my adult life. Because here is what I did not do. I did not confront Derek. I did not cry in front of him. I did not check his phone while he slept or accuse him at dinner or call Natalie at her office. I did not perform grief for an audience of one who had already decided the show was over. What I did was watch, and listen, and build. I noticed the nights he came home smelling like a different dry shampoo. I noticed the restaurant charges on the personal card he thought I didn't know the number for. A steakhouse we'd never been to together. A cinema booking in a row that seats 2. I noticed the motel off I-24 that appeared 3 Wednesdays in a row. I noticed the way he stopped asking about my day, not because he was tired, but because he was somewhere else already, mentally out, physically present only out of habit. If you have ever been in a relationship where you slowly became invisible, where the person across from you stopped seeing you not through cruelty but through indifference, I think you already know what those 4 months felt like. That specific loneliness that has no name because it lives inside something that is supposed to be love. If that's landing somewhere real for you right now, hit like, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not imagining it. Because I promise you, what comes next is the part that changed everything. What Derek did not know, while I was quietly watching and he was quietly leaving, is that I had already called a family law attorney named Patricia Hollis, who charged $380 an hour, and told me I was the most prepared client she'd had in years. I had already opened a private savings account at a bank he'd never heard me mention. I had already said yes to the director title at Meridian, the one he'd been nudging me away from for 8 months. $21,000 more a year. Benefits upgrade. Effective immediately. The house looked exactly the same. Dinner was made, the wine glasses were clean, and every single night Derek came home to a woman he believed he understood completely. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. 4 months is a long time to keep a secret from someone who sleeps 12 inches away from you. I want to be honest about that, because I think people hear a story like this, and they assume the person who knew was somehow cold, detached, that she must not have really loved him if she could watch all of that and say nothing. And I understand why it looks that way from the outside. But what I actually felt during those 4 months was not coldness. It was something closer to grief that had nowhere to go yet. A kind of underwater sadness, present, heavy, but muffled. Like the sound of something breaking in another room. I still made dinner. I still asked about his day. Not because I was performing, or not only because of that, but because some part of me was still hoping I had it wrong. That the D+N on the calendar had an explanation I hadn't considered. That the Marriott was a client. That the dry shampoo smell was a gym or a carpool or anything other than what I knew it was. The thing about knowing the truth before you're ready to hold it is that you spend a lot of time making deals with yourself. If he comes home early tonight, maybe I imagined it. He didn't come home early. Not once. By December, I stopped making deals. I started making lists. The campaign against me, if you can call it that, didn't start until after the divorce was filed. But I want to tell you about it here because it's important context for understanding what Derek actually believed about me. He believed, genuinely, that the narrative he was going to tell people would land. That the story of Crystal and Derek growing apart would be accepted without question, because in his version of events, Crystal was the quiet, agreeable one, the easy one, the one who wouldn't push back. He started with his friends. Brad heard it first. The careful, curated version where Derek had simply been unhappy for years and had finally made the hard choice. No mention of Natalie. No mention of motels on Wednesdays. Just two people who had drifted, said with the appropriate amount of performative sadness. Brad told his wife Shelley. Shelley texted me 3 days after the filing with a message so carefully neutral it was almost funny. Just want you to know I'm here for you. These things are so hard. I thanked her and did not elaborate. The version that circulated among Derek's work colleagues was slightly different, and I only know this because of what happened later, which I'll get to. The version that reached his office was that Crystal had become withdrawn, that she'd pulled away emotionally, that Derek had tried for years to reach her and finally accepted that some people just can't meet you where you are. Withdrawn. That word made me laugh out loud when I heard it. Alone in my car, laughing. Because what Derek had interpreted as withdrawal was actually the opposite. It was the most intentional I had ever been in my entire life. It just wasn't pointed in his direction anymore. Here's what my life looked like after I moved my things out of the bedroom. I woke up at 6:15 every morning in the guest room, which I had quietly rearranged to feel like mine. New pillow, the lamp from my office that Derek always said looked wrong in that room, a small stack of books I'd been meaning to read for 2 years. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before the day started, which was something I had not done in 6 years because Derek's mornings were loud and scheduled and somehow always became about him. I went to work at Meridian as Director of Brand Strategy, and I was, without exaggeration, the best version of a professional I had ever been. There is something about having nothing left to protect in your personal life that frees up an enormous amount of cognitive space. I redesigned a regional campaign for a healthcare client that my team had been struggling with for months. We cracked it in 2 weeks. My boss, a woman named Janet who had been trying to promote me for almost a year, pulled me into her office after the client presentation and said, "Whatever changed, keep it." I called Becca every Sunday. She drove up from Nashville twice during the divorce proceedings, both times without me asking, both times with food and wine and that specific quality of presence she has always had, where she doesn't try to fix anything, she just makes sure you're not alone with it. The second time she came up, she sat across from me at the kitchen table at 11 at night and said, "You seem different." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You seem like you're actually here." I didn't know how to explain to her that I had been practicing being here for 4 months, that watching someone betray you from a distance teaches you, in the most backhanded possible way, how to pay attention again. The papers were finalized in April. Derek moved into an apartment near Natalie's part of town. I knew the neighborhood, not because I looked it up, but because Brad mentioned it to Ryan, and Ryan mentioned it to me, and by that point Ryan and I had started having coffee on weekday mornings, which was its own thing I'll get to. I want to pause here for a second, because this is the part of the story where people sometimes have opinions. I know what it looks like, a woman whose marriage just ended spending time with her ex-husband's best friend. I know how that reads. But I want you to understand what Ryan Kowalski actually was to me in those first weeks after the divorce. He wasn't a rebound. He wasn't a statement. He was the first person in Derek's entire social circle who called me, not Derek, the day after the filing was public, and said, "I just want to make sure you're okay." Not, "This must be so hard for both of you." Not, "I'm here for whatever you both need." Me, specifically. He called to check on me specifically. Tell me, have you ever had someone in your life choose you so clearly, in a moment when most people were carefully choosing sides or choosing nobody? Drop it in the comments. Because I think a lot of people watching this have been in that room where everyone goes quiet, and knowing who stayed, or who made the first call, changes you. It changed me. Ryan and I had coffee that Tuesday, then dinner the following week, then more dinners. Nothing dramatic, nothing manufactured. Just two people talking in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely equal. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He disagreed with me about things, small things, restaurants, a movie we'd both seen, and somehow that was the most restoring part. Being disagreed with by someone who was still clearly on your side. Derek found out about 3 weeks in. I know because Ryan told me the same night it happened. Derek called him on a Tuesday. Ryan said Derek's voice was that specific, controlled upset that men use when they're furious but don't want to appear furious. "You're seeing my ex-wife." And Ryan, who is one of the most genuinely straightforward people I have ever known, said, "You cheated on her for 8 months, man." There was silence. Then Derek said, "I'm not doing this." And Ryan said, "Neither am I," and hung up. When Ryan told me this, I was standing in my kitchen. I put my hand on the counter and just stood there for a second. Because here is the thing about Derek's jealousy, and I want you to really hear this. He had no right to it. Not even a technical claim. He had ended the marriage. He was living near his girlfriend. He had told his friends the story of a mutual, amicable uncoupling. And yet the idea of me, quiet, withdrawn Crystal, being anything other than quietly, withdrawnly alone, was apparently more than he could process. His possessiveness had never been about love. I understood that completely in the moment Ryan described that phone call to me. It had been about inventory. I was something he owned, and the problem with divorce, from his perspective, was that it had somehow failed to remove me from his life the way he expected. He thought freedom meant I would disappear. He had not considered what I might do with mine. I considered it. I had been considering it for months. And in May, at a cross-industry networking event that Meridian hosted every year, I walked into a room as Director of Brand Strategy, and I met, properly this time, Marcus Webb. I had met Marcus Webb exactly once before that night. It was at a Caldwell and Briggs Christmas party 3 years earlier, when I was still Derek's +1. I remember standing near the bar in a dress I'd bought specifically because Derek mentioned Natalie, though I didn't know her name then, didn't know anything then, would probably dress up. I remember Derek introducing me with that particular phrasing husbands sometimes use, that is technically a compliment and functionally a diminishment. "This is my wife Crystal. She does marketing." Not, "She's a senior brand strategist." Not, "She just landed the Henderson account." She does marketing. Like a hobby. Like something to keep her occupied. Marcus had shaken my hand and asked what kind of marketing. I told him. He asked a follow-up question, a real one, specific, about campaign measurement, and we talked for maybe 4 minutes before Derek materialized at my elbow with a fresh drink and a redirecting hand at my back, and the conversation ended. 4 minutes. Marcus told me later he remembered it. He said what he remembered was the gap between how Derek described me and who I actually was when given 48 inches of conversational space. He said that gap was notable. I didn't know any of that on the night of the May mixer. I walked in as Director of Brand Strategy in the dark green blouse and the black trousers and my hair down, and I was not thinking about Derek or Ryan or any of it. I was thinking about the Caldwell and Briggs expansion into the Carolinas that I'd read about in a trade publication, and whether there was a brand partnership angle worth exploring, because that is genuinely how my brain works at industry events. I was there to work. Marcus found me at the bar 20 minutes in. "Crystal Hargrove," he said, "you're running Meridian's brand strategy now." "I am," I said, "and you're Marcus Webb. I read about the Carolina expansion. The timing was interesting. What made you move now rather than last fall?" He looked at me for a moment. Not the way men sometimes look at women at industry events. That particular assessing look that has nothing to do with what you just said. He looked at me like the question had genuinely caught his attention. "That," he said, "is a very good question." We talked for an hour. He asked for my card. He emailed me the next morning about a potential brand consultancy partnership. Professional, specific, with 3 concrete questions about Meridian's capacity and timeline. I replied within the hour. We scheduled a call. The call became a meeting. The meeting, 3 weeks later, became dinner. It was a business dinner. And then, about 45 minutes in, it was not a business dinner. And we both knew it, and neither of us said anything about it, and we talked for 3 hours. I need to tell you about the night before everything converged, because it's the part of this story I think about most. It was a Thursday. I was at my kitchen table, the table, always the table, with a yellow legal pad. Not making a list this time, just sitting. Becca had called earlier and asked how I was feeling about the next day, because by then I knew about the quarterly review. I knew Marcus would be announcing the Meridian partnership. I knew Derek would be in the room. I hadn't engineered any of it. I want to be precise about that. I had not pursued Marcus to get to Derek. I had not accepted the Caldwell contract as a strategic move in some elaborate plan. I had simply lived my life, the life that was already waiting for me on the other side of a marriage that had been quietly suffocating me for years, and the life had arranged itself into something that was, in its final shape, almost poetic. But sitting at that table Thursday night, I wasn't feeling poetic. I was feeling the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and can finally see the place where she gets to set it down. Becca said on the phone, "How are you really?" I said, "Tired, but the good kind. The kind that means something is almost over." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You know, when you called me that October night, from the driveway totally calm, I almost didn't believe you were okay. I thought you were in shock." "I was," I said. "I just didn't look like it." "No," she said. "You never do." Friday afternoon. The quarterly review at Caldwell and Briggs was scheduled for 2 o'clock. I wasn't there. I want to be clear, I was not in that room. I was at Meridian, in a client meeting that ran long, eating a sandwich at my desk at 4:15, when my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan that said, "Call me when you can." What happened in that room, I know from Ryan, who heard it from Brad, who was present and texted Ryan before the meeting had even officially ended. Marcus ran the review. Midway through, he announced the firm's new brand partnership with Meridian Creative Group. He said it was a significant contract. He said the work coming out of Meridian's strategy division was some of the sharpest brand thinking he'd encountered in this regional market. He said the director of strategy there had a mind for positioning that was, in his exact words, genuinely rare. He did not say my name. He didn't need to. Derek knew. Every person in that room who knew Derek's personal life, which, in a 60-person firm where Natalie worked 3 offices down, was most of them, knew. The silence that followed Marcus's remarks was, by Brad's account, the specific silence of a room full of people carefully not looking at one person. Brad said Derek's face went through several stages in approximately 4 seconds. He said Derek picked up his pen and wrote something on his notepad and didn't look up for the rest of the meeting. When Ryan told me this, I was sitting in my car in the Meridian parking garage, phone pressed to my ear. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I had spent months telling myself and telling Becca that I wasn't doing any of this for Derek, that the point was never to wound him, that I was building a life, not a retaliation. And sitting in that parking garage, I realized I had been telling the truth without fully knowing it, because what I felt when Ryan described that room was not satisfaction. It was something quieter, something that felt, underneath everything, like grief. Grief for the version of Derek I had married, for the man I thought I saw in him that first year, the steady, present, genuinely kind man who had turned out to be a performance that couldn't hold past a certain point. Grief for the 6 years, for the promotion I deferred, for the mornings I didn't sit at the table with coffee because his schedule was louder than my need for quiet. That is the moment, sitting in that parking garage, phone in my lap after Ryan hung up, where I finally cried. Not the gasping, falling apart kind, just a slow, steady release, like the pressure finally finding an exit that had been waiting a long time. If you've ever had the thing you wanted land and felt grief instead of joy, if you've ever been right about something and wished for just 1 second that you'd been wrong, hit that like button. Subscribe, because that feeling has no good name, and I think more people carry it than ever admit it out loud. It's the feeling of being free when freedom cost you something real. I sat in that car for 11 minutes. Then I drove home. I need to tell you about Natalie, because she deserves a full sentence in this story and not just a footnote. I don't hate Natalie Cross. I thought I would. I expected to, the way you expect certain emotions to arrive on schedule. But what I actually feel when I think about her is something closer to pity, and not the condescending kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from recognizing something. Natalie believed she had won Derek. She had reorganized her entire self-image around being chosen over me. She had told herself a story about the marriage, that it had been over long before she arrived, that she was not the cause but the consequence, and she had believed it so completely that it became her truth. I know this because people talk, and eventually everything surfaces in a network as small as one regional consulting firm. What Natalie did not account for was that Derek's jealousy did not end at the divorce. She had watched him become increasingly preoccupied with what I was doing, who I was seeing, where my career was going, and the version of Derek she had been sold was a man who had outgrown me, who had moved cleanly on, who was free. That man did not match the man checking his phone at dinner and going quiet when someone mentioned my name. After the quarterly review, by Brad's account, Natalie asked Derek why he seemed so far away. He said, "Work stuff." She watched him staring at his phone, and she understood, I think, for the first time, that what she had won was not a free man. It was a man who had never learned to actually see the woman in front of him, any woman, and she was next in line for the same slow, disappearing act. I don't know what happened between them after that. I stopped tracking it the way you stop checking the weather in a city you no longer live in. What I know is that I drove home that Friday. I made dinner for one. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for no particular reason and decided this was reason enough. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass and no list and no legal pad and no plan. Just the quiet. Mine. Finally, completely mine. The consequences came the way consequences usually do. Not all at once, and not because anyone orchestrated them. They came because Derek's behavior after the divorce was the behavior of a man who had never developed the ability to sit quietly with something he couldn't control. And in a firm of 60 people, where professional reputation is built on the perception of steadiness, that kind of behavior has a shelf life. The first thing I heard, through Ryan, who heard it from Brad, was that Derek had started making comments at work. Nothing explicit, nothing you could point at in an HR filing. Just the kind of ambient resentment that poisons a room slowly, the way a slow gas leak poisons a house. Comments about the Meridian partnership that were slightly too sharp to be professional. A comment in a team meeting about external consultants who got lucky with connections. A comment at the coffee station that Natalie overheard and later told someone else about, the way uncomfortable things always travel. Marcus noticed. Marcus, who had built an entire firm on the principle that performance mattered more than personality, but that personality eventually ate performance, noticed within 2 weeks. I didn't hear what exactly was said in the conversation between Marcus and Derek. I don't know if it was formal or quiet or somewhere in between. What I know is that by the end of May, Derek had been moved laterally, same title, different territory, away from the accounts that mattered most. In a sales organization, that lateral move is a language everyone speaks. It doesn't need translation. Brad called Ryan. Ryan called me. I was in the middle of making pasta when the call came in, and I turned the burner to low and listened, and when Ryan finished, I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." And I meant it, not as performance, as the honest, simple truth of a person who had stopped wanting bad things for someone they used to love. Ryan said, "You sure you're okay?" I said, "I'm making pasta. I think I'm okay." He laughed. It was the right response. The social geometry shifted in the way these things always shift, gradually, then suddenly. Shelley stopped sending carefully neutral texts. Brad started calling Ryan less. The dinner parties that had been a fixture of Derek's social life quietly stopped being scheduled because the person who had actually made them happen, who had remembered the details, managed the RSVPs, chosen the wine and the menu, and sent the follow-up text the next morning, had been me. And I was no longer available for that particular unpaid labor. Ryan said Derek mentioned once, in passing, that the friend group felt different, quieter. Ryan said he didn't know how to explain to Derek that the group had never been loud on its own, that Crystal had been the warmth in those rooms, and what he was experiencing now was just the room without her in it. Two people came back to me, genuinely, specifically, without agenda. The first was Shelley, who called me, not texted, called, on a Saturday morning in June and said, "I owe you a real conversation and a real apology." She said she had known, or suspected, about Natalie for longer than she admitted, and that staying neutral had been a choice she was not proud of. She said she missed me. She asked if I wanted to get lunch. I said yes. We had lunch. It was imperfect and a little awkward in the way honest things sometimes are, and it was real, and I was glad she called. The second was Derek's mother, Linda, a woman I had genuinely loved, who had gone quiet during the divorce in the way mothers sometimes do when they're caught between loyalty and truth. She sent me a card, handwritten, 4 sentences. She said she was sorry for how things had gone. She said she had always seen me. She said she hoped I was well. I read it at the kitchen table. I read it twice. I put it in the drawer with the yellow legal pad. I did not reach out to the people who didn't come back. I had no list for that. Some distances, once established, are just geography. You stop expecting the landscape to rearrange itself, and you learn the new map. There is a letter I wrote and never sent. I wrote it on a Sunday afternoon in late June, at the table, with the windows open and the ceiling fan turning, and the particular quality of afternoon light that comes through Tennessee windows in early summer, amber and unhurried, like it has nowhere else to be. I wrote it to Derek. Not to send, not to wound, not to explain myself in the way I had sometimes fantasized about during those 4 months of watching, the perfect articulation of everything he had failed to see. I wrote it because I needed to say it somewhere, even if only to the legal pad and the afternoon light. I wrote, "You thought asking for freedom meant you were the one leaving. You didn't understand that I had been planning to go for months. You thought I was the quiet one. I was the prepared one. Those are not the same thing," I wrote. "You spent 6 years making me smaller, and then you were surprised when the thing you left didn't look like what you remembered. That's because you were never really looking." And then I wrote the thing that surprised me, the thing I didn't know I needed to say until I was saying it. I hope you figure out how to actually see someone. I hope you learn it before it costs you more than it already has. Not because you deserve that from me, because you are still a person, and people can still change, and I am done carrying the weight of hoping you won't. I read it back. Then I folded it in half and put it in the drawer with Linda's card and the legal pad, because some things are complete the moment they're written, and don't need to travel further than that. I called Becca and read her the last paragraph. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most Crystal Lynn thing I have ever heard in my life." I said, "Is that good?" She said, "It means you're back." It is a Tuesday morning in July now. I am at the kitchen table with coffee. The windows are open. The ceiling fan is turning the same slow way it turned the afternoon I wrote the letter. Outside, the neighborhood is doing its morning sounds. A lawnmower 2 houses down, a car backing out of a driveway, a bird I cannot name but have heard every morning for the 3 months I've been living here alone, and have started to think of as company. On the table in front of me is a contract. Meridian Creative Group and Caldwell and Briggs Financial Consulting, Brand Strategy Partnership, 3-year term. My signature is already on page 14. Marcus's is on page 15. We signed it in the Meridian conference room last Thursday, with my team around us, and Marcus shook my hand with both of his the way people do when they mean more than a handshake. And I drove home with the windows down and the radio loud, and I felt for the first time in what felt like a very long time, like the exact right size. Not small, not performing large, just exactly the size I actually am. I thought about calling Becca when I got home. I thought about telling her all of it, the conference room, the contract, the drive home. I thought about the October night in the driveway when I called her and told her what I knew about Natalie, my voice completely even, and she asked me what I wanted to do, and I said nothing yet. I thought about how much distance lives between nothing yet and here. How many mornings at this table? How many lists? How many quiet decisions made in the dark? I didn't call her that night. I made dinner instead. I set one place at the table. I poured one glass of wine, and I sat with the evening in a way I am still learning, still practicing, this specific and ordinary art of being exactly where I am, without apology, without performance, without waiting for someone to notice. My name is Crystal Lynn Hargrove. I'm 34 years old, and I finally know what it feels like to take up the right amount of space. Derek asked for a divorce to be free. He had no idea what he was setting in motion. He had no idea that the woman he had been slowly making smaller for 6 years had a savings account he didn't know about, an attorney already on retainer, a promotion she had been holding in her back pocket like a card she was waiting to play. He had no idea that the quiet one was the prepared one. He had no idea that freedom, when you hand it to the right person, becomes something they know exactly what to do with. He set me free, and I have been walking ever since like I know where I'm going. Before I go, I want to ask you something real. Something I've been sitting with since I started telling this story. Has someone ever underestimated you so completely that when you finally showed them who you actually were, it changed the whole landscape? Not a dramatic moment, maybe just a quiet one, in a parking garage, or at a kitchen table, or on a drive home with the windows down. The moment you realized you had already become who you were trying to be, while nobody was watching. I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that, not as a sign-off phrase, but as a genuine thing. Your stories are the reason I keep telling mine. If this one stayed with you, if any part of Crystal's story felt like something you've been carrying without a name for it, hit the like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being the quiet one and being the prepared one are not the same thing. That the woman everyone underestimated might just be the woman building her exit at the kitchen table at midnight. She always was.